Hey everyone, it's Patricia Warby here from Alchemy Therapies and My Emotional Audit. And today I wanted to do a follow-up looking at what causes people to have a long, healthy life or not. Last week I talked about the sad death of Sinead O'Connor, who we still don't know, but I presume she ended her own life at the age of 59. I think she was 59 or 57. Certainly she didn't reach 60, which was incredibly sad for someone so absolutely talented and heartfelt. You know, she lived life fully with her heart, as we say, on her sleeve. You know, you always knew what she was feeling. She certainly felt really strongly. And I wanted to contrast that with people who live into old age, and what may be at the root of that is not necessarily just the food you eat or how much exercise you do. The big missing link is to do with what happens to you in childhood, what we talk about as adverse childhood events. And adverse childhood events are not necessarily serious things like what Sinead suffered, the abuse and the instability, but they can be drip fed small things, what we call small t trauma. And one of the first and most important small t traumas is how you come into the world, the way you're born. Now, I've done another separate video on birth trauma. I'm not going to go into that in depth today. I want to talk about how it affects the way you relate to others. And at the heart of this is attachment. Now, attachment theory was developed post-war, actually, by a British researcher, a group of researchers, actually, based on what had happened to wartime children when they were evacuated from the cities prior to the bombing raids that started in 1939, and seeing what happened to them afterwards. The researchers noticed that there were certain patterns that children fell into, and that indeed, as they developed this theory, they found that you could predict the kind of life pattern of relationships from how the children were in relationship to their parents. So attachment is a fancy word for bonding. Okay, a bonding to your parents, usually mum in the first 6 months of your life, and then dad becomes more important later on. That's the typical pattern. And it's one of the most common traumas, is that attachment doesn't follow the ideal route. You know, there is an attachment wound. We call it a wound. I prefer a wound because a wound can heal. That's why I wrote my book, The Scar That Won't Heal, way back 2015. It's been republished several times since. But it's a wound that you carry with you silently, which affects the way your body works, because it's a physiological instruction, if you like, to your cells that either give you a good long life, like, say, someone like Dame Vera Lynn, who I talked about once before, who lived to 100, and I think she was 103 when she died. Or you contrast that with someone like Sinead dying in her mid to late 50s. And what it consists of is basically the strategy that you form to get your emotional needs met from your parent, usually mum. And there are four common styles. There is a secure pattern, which is where you can reasonably anticipate that your needs are going to be met, and you learn to think and feel, usually simultaneously. Certainly that's in balance. And I don't see these people in my therapy room, obviously, because secure people feel okay about the world and they can generally regulate their own bodies, and they tend to be reasonably healthy as well. Then there are three other groups, two of which are what we call insecure. And it sounds awful, but it just means the requirement for your emotional needs being met is not a secure one. So you can't always anticipate that your emotional needs are going to be met reliably. And so many things can affect that, as I've said. So how you come into the world, if you came in fast, if you came in via induced, you were forceps or ventouses, maybe you were too early and you had to be put in an incubator, or there was some other trauma around your birth that can definitely affect your bonding, as it did for me when I was born. I was quite fast. I came into the world via, I think, suction. it could have been forceps. It was a while ago, but I ended up with a really large birthmark on my face, on one half of my face from that, which affected the way my mom was able to look at me in the first few weeks and months of life before it faded. It faded by the time I was about 1. And I imagine, I can't remember it, obviously, when she looked at me, she might have felt sad or sorrowful, or perhaps a little guilty, because, you know, my face was damaged, and maybe that affected the way she gazed at me. And gaze is all about social connection, and it's part of your upper vagal system, which enables your eyes to connect with someone, the way you hold your facial muscles. If you crinkle and smile, that's very regulating to a baby's heart rate. Alternatively, if you look angry or you look sad because you feel sad about the baby, or you feel overwhelmed or frozen, dissociated. Now, as I'm going through those emotions, I'm actually mimicking those on my face. So I hope you can notice the effect on you as I change my facial expression. Imagine being a tiny baby, having a mother who doesn't look at you, who turns away from you, or who looks angry or disconnected. Maybe she's depressed because of the hormonal changes that often happen with birth. You know, she's got postnatal depression. She just looks flat. The baby's heart rate can't regulate properly when that happens. The social engagement system is really vital to inhibit fight and flight, and it changes the way your whole pattern of responding to stress for the rest of your life actually happens. And so if it's insecure for whatever reason, you have 2 strategies that you can develop. You can develop the avoidant strategy, which is where you become very disconnected from your feelings, and you tend to exist in analysis and reason and thinking. We sometimes call these avoidant people because they don't really engage with their emotions. They seem to have it all sorted. But they can be quite dismissive as adults because they don't understand why other people feel so much, because they've disconnected that sort of body information. And they can be narcissistic as well. That can be a tendency to control others for that reason. So that's the insecure avoidant types. And then there's a subcategory which is insecure ambivalent or anxious. And they become rather anxious adults who kind of want connection. They feel so much, they need others to regulate them. They can get very enmeshed in relationships. We sometimes think of them as preoccupied. We call it preoccupied. You know, they're always thinking about how's the relationship going. They can be considered quite needy, and they can hate that about themselves. And they often meet avoidant people in relationship and form relationships with the opposite style, because initially that's very compatible, as you can imagine, but it tends to fall apart after a while because these styles were developed in childhood. They're not adult, and they often are very fixed and very lacking resilience. You know, if you're always responding in a certain way, you're always going to get the same result, and it loses flexibility of response. So these people can often become codependent in relationships. And as I said, their boundaries are very poor. They don't really know where you end, they end and you begin. And so working with those 2 different types of people, you have to have very different strategies as a therapist. And, you know, for one, the avoidance, you're trying to encourage them imaginatively to connect with their bodies a little more because they've disconnected that source of feeling information. For the ambivalent, anxious people, you need to help them rationalize a little and kind of frame things a little better. And so getting them into coherence the way to do that is actually to be consistent and to always follow up and deliver what you've promised as a therapist. And indeed, if you're in a relationship with someone like that, you know, consistency is really key. And then there's a 4th type. So we've done secure, insecure, avoidant, insecure, anxious, and now the 4th type, disordered. Now, these people tended to grow up in very traumatic households Maybe a parent was addicted or had mental health issues. This would be Sinead, for instance. Now, these people have a terrific wound of attunement. They couldn't attune with a parent at all. And in fact, they never felt safe in that relationship. And so they're always seeking safety in other ways, usually, as we saw with Sinead, through music, which really helped her, and then religion, which perhaps didn't help quite so much. But it's a strategy that's destined to fail until you address the underlying root cause, which is that you don't feel safe in your body and you can't think or feel, certainly not at the same time. These people tend to end up in addiction. Sometimes they have issues of really serious mental health problems, and they will tend to be suffering from either bipolar disorder, some forms of ADHD, for instance, all sorts of things where the nervous system is not regulating properly. It's bouncing around different states. It can't do this smooth regulation that is supposed to happen. So it's really about getting your needs met. That's what attachment is, and finding ways in which to change the patterns that were formed early on in childhood. Now, what good therapy should do is really bring in the interconnected safety of an emotionally stable other. You are providing the proxy for what was not present in the original mother-child bond or parent-child bond. And so being neurally regulated yourself is really, really key. And the way you communicate that is by a modulated voice, which I'm using now, and a smiley, soft face, and engaging with that person with good, eye connection and a soft, crinkly gaze. Because the person is seeking reassurance that they can feel safe. For some of them, it's they can feel safe for the very first time. For others, it's to be reminded of safety. Even in the worst childhoods, there was always islands of safety. Maybe it was a grandparent, maybe it was a family friend, maybe it was a school teacher who took special care of you. Islands of safety do exist, but they weren't consistent enough. And so these strategies that you've adopted become the patterns for the rest of your life unless they are addressed. And that's what good therapy should do. So look, it's very important, isn't it, to get this really into your way of being, and create a new model of safety so that your habitual patterns can be addressed. And the final thing I want to say is that when we have these old wounds present in our bodies as unexpressed needs, we tend to have physical symptoms. We have all manner of chronic disease. We have a terrific amount of shame, and shame is a body-based experience. It's not feeling ashamed. That's not the same thing. That's a cognitive awareness. This is not about what you do, it's about who you are, and it will undermine you at every stage. It will say you're not enough. It will say there's no point trying. It will say it doesn't matter what you do, you'll always fail. Or it'll make you incredibly competitive going the other way, and you'll be one of those people that has to prove themselves and be better than everyone else and be highly critical of yourself and others. And so shame drives a lot of really unpleasant and difficult behavior that we're seeing all over the internet right now. People shaming each other routinely. It's everywhere in social media. It's everywhere in the media generally. And it can cause people to actually self-abuse. And self-abuse is not necessarily the overt physical self-abuse. It can be failing to take care of yourself. It can be it can be self-harm, but it isn't always. It can also be just not taking breaks. It can be overworking. It can be addictions. It can be that critical self-talk that we all have, you're useless, what's the point? And it creates a huge cycle of down-regulation of your rest and repair mechanisms. And when that happens, of course, you're going to get more long-term chronic disease. You're going to get more things that are likely to end your life sooner. So getting these attachment strategies addressed, and the memories that underlie those is what I do for a living. And I help people come into a better balance with themselves, what I call coming home to yourself as you really are, and not the strategy that you had to adopt. So, folks, I hope that was interesting. And if you want to contact me, I'll leave the links below. Please subscribe. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.